The rain hadn't stopped since the funeral. It drummed against the windshield as I pulled into the long gravel driveway of my grandfather's estate in northern Maine. The place looked exactly like I remembered, only quieter, heavier somehow. The shutters rattled in the wind, and the vines that crawled up the stone walls had turned black with rot. I parked next to a row of luxury SUVs that weren't there when I was a kid and sat in the car for a while, hands on the steering wheel, watching the lights flicker inside the house. I hadn't been back in 15 years. Life had taken me south. A job in construction, a small apartment in Boston, a quiet existence far from this old mansion and the people who lived in it. Now, because Cornelius Gray was gone, every relative with a drop of gray blood had shown up to claim what was left of him. When I walked through the front door, the familiar scent hit me: old books, cedar, and the faint trace of cigar smoke that never left the wallpaper. The main hall was crowded. My Uncle Richard, my father's older brother, stood near the fireplace, already barking orders at the estate lawyer. His wife, Elaine, perfectly polished as always, clutched a wine glass like she was hosting a gala instead of a wake. My cousins were there too, people I barely recognized but could tell exactly who they'd become by their clothes and the way they avoided eye contact. Richard spotted me first. His voice boomed through the hall. "Well, if it isn't our prodigal nephew, Mark Gray. Back from Boston to check if the old man left you a piece of the pie." I dropped my duffel bag by the door. "I'm here because he was my grandfather. Not for money." Richard smirked. "Everyone's here for something, kid." He turned back to the lawyer like I hadn't spoken. I walked deeper into the house, past the grand staircase and into the living room. The portraits of our ancestors still hung on the walls, glaring down like silent judges. My father used to tell me those eyes could see through lies. I used to believe him. In the corner sat my father, David, quiet as always, turning his wedding ring between his fingers. He looked smaller than I remembered, the years of teaching and disappointment carving lines across his face. Mom was gone now, taken by cancer years before, and her absence lingered around him like a shadow. Dad looked up when he saw me. "You made it through the storm." "Barely," I said, taking off my jacket. The power flickered just as I said it, plunging the room into a second of darkness before the lights came back. Richard was still talking loudly to the lawyer about property values and liquid assets. His voice echoed through the house like nails on glass. I tried not to listen. Instead, I wandered to the back of the room where the old family photographs were displayed. One caught my eye, a picture of me at 10 years old, standing in the garden beside my grandfather. He had one hand on my shoulder, a rare smile on his face. For a man who built an empire in pharmaceuticals, he'd always been distant but never cruel. He used to tell me truth mattered more than reputation. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I left the photo behind and walked toward the kitchen, hoping for some air that didn't smell like money and resentment. The kitchen was dim and cold, the kind of cold that came from years of silence. Then I noticed something strange. On the far wall, near the pantry, a faint draft brushed against my neck. I touched the paneling and realized it wasn't solid wood. There was a seam running along the edge, perfectly fitted but out of place. A door. Before I could look closer, footsteps approached behind me. It was my cousin Trevor, the self-proclaimed entrepreneur who'd burned through 3 startups and 2 marriages before 35. "Looking for the wine cellar or buried treasure," he joked, leaning against the counter. "Just needed a break from Uncle Richard's voice." He grinned, poured himself a drink, and said, "He's been here all week making sure the lawyer knows who's in charge. Word is the estate's worth millions. Grandpa must have hidden something big." Hidden something. The words stuck in my head long after he left. That night, after everyone went to bed, I couldn't sleep. The storm had quieted, leaving the house in uneasy silence. I wandered downstairs with a flashlight, drawn back to that panel in the kitchen. The seam was almost invisible now in the dark, but the draft was there, cold and steady. I pressed my hand against the panel until it gave a little, like a hidden latch was behind it. Something clicked softly. The panel swung open an inch, just enough for me to see a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. My pulse hammered in my ears. I hesitated, then heard a faint sound from below, a low creak. Like wood shifting. Or maybe something else. I told myself it was nothing. Probably old pipes or wind in the walls. I should have gone back upstairs. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight tighter and took the first step down. The air grew colder with each step. Dust floated in the beam of light. Tiny ghosts suspended in time. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a small concrete hallway. The walls were covered with decades of grime. And at the far end stood a heavy metal door, sealed shut, with dark red wax. My chest tightened. The wax bore the imprint of my grandfather's signet ring, the same one I'd seen on his hand at the funeral. I reached out, tracing the edge of the seal. The metal beneath was freezing. For some reason, touching it filled me with dread, like the air itself was holding its breath. Behind me, the house creaked again. Louder this time. A floorboard groaned. I turned off the flashlight and listened. Nothing. Only the faint whisper of wind through the old vents. I took one last look at the sealed door before backing away. Whatever was behind it wasn't meant to be disturbed. Not yet. When I came back up to the kitchen, my father was standing there in his robe, holding a glass of water. His eyes narrowed when he saw me. Couldn't sleep either, just checking something. I said. He nodded slowly. There are some things in this house better left alone. Mark. He went back upstairs. And I stood there in the dim light. The words echoing in my head. Better left alone. But I already knew I wouldn't. Outside, the storm had stopped. But the air still felt charged. Like the night was waiting for something to break. I didn't know it then. But that door in the basement would change everything I thought I knew about my family and about the man I thought my grandfather was. The next morning, the house felt different. The storm had moved east, leaving a gray fog that pressed against the windows. Everyone was already awake. Voices echoing from the dining room. The smell of burnt coffee mixed with the faint scent of old carpet. I could hear Uncle Richard talking to the lawyer again. Louder than necessary. Like he owned the place already. I walked in, trying not to look as tired as I felt. Richard barely glanced at me. He was wearing one of his tailored suits. The kind that didn't fit the mood of a grieving family. He was pointing at blueprints spread across the table, talking about subdividing the property, turning the guest house into rentals. The lawyer, a thin man named Paul Landon, looked exhausted. He rubbed his temples and said that everything had to go through probate first. But Richard wasn't listening. Elaine stood behind him, nodding like a queen approving her general's plan. Dad sat at the end of the table, stirring his coffee in silence. He hadn't said a word all morning. When I took the seat next to him, he gave me a small nod. Paul noticed me and tried to sound polite. Mark, your grandfather's estate is more complicated than expected. He left a number of restricted areas and personal items that aren't listed in the will. We'll need to inventory them before we proceed. Richard interrupted. That means we go through everything. Every room. Every drawer. Every damn secret he was hiding. Paul frowned. That's not quite what I meant. But nothing. Richard snapped. If there's something valuable, we're not leaving it to rot. I felt my stomach tighten. I thought about the sealed door in the basement. The wax. The cold air. The image of that signet ring pressed into red wax wouldn't leave my head. After breakfast, I tried to find a quiet corner. But the house was alive with movement. My cousins were digging through closets, opening boxes, taking photos of antiques like vultures circling a carcass. Elaine's laughter echoed down the hallway as she discovered a jewelry box. I walked away. Down to the study. The smell of leather and dust was stronger there. Sunlight cut through the blinds in thin white lines across the bookshelves. I opened the top drawer of the old mahogany desk, the same one my grandfather used when I was a kid. Most of it was empty except for some fountain pens, a stack of old invoices, and a small brass key. It was taped to the underside of the drawer. My heart jumped. The key was ornate, old-fashioned, the kind that didn't fit modern locks. My thumb traced the pattern engraved into its handle, a faint letter G at the center. I pocketed it and closed the drawer just as my father walked in. He looked at me carefully. You're quiet this morning. Just tired. Long drive. I said. He sighed. You don't have to stay. You know, let Richard handle the chaos. Someone has to make sure he doesn't burn the place down, I said. Dad almost smiled, then turned serious. He loved this house. Your grandfather, more than any of us. There are things here he never wanted us to see. I hesitated. What kind of things? Dad looked out the window. Secrets. Maybe. Mistakes. He didn't explain further. Just walked out, leaving me alone with the echo of his words. That afternoon, as everyone argued upstairs, I returned to the kitchen. The seam in the wall was still there, faint but visible. I ran my fingers over it until I found the latch again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I slipped the brass key into the lock hidden behind the panel. It fit perfectly. A single click echoed, and the panel shifted open, revealing the staircase again. The air that came out was freezing, damp, and heavy. I descended slowly, flashlight in one hand, the other on the wall. The steps creaked under my weight. Dust swirled around my shoes. The metal door at the bottom looked even older in the daylight that filtered weakly from the cracks above. The wax seal was cracked slightly at the edge, as if someone had touched it before. I crouched closer. The imprint of my grandfather's ring was unmistakable. The same ring now resting in his coffin 2 miles away. I touched the seal. It felt brittle, ready to break. I hesitated, thinking of Dad's warning. But curiosity burned hotter than fear. I pressed the key into the small lock beneath the seal. The mechanism turned, slow and stiff, until I heard a faint metallic snap. The wax crumbled under my fingers. The door gave way an inch. Behind me, a voice said my name. I froze. Trevor stood halfway down the stairs, holding a flashlight of his own. What the hell are you doing? I straightened up, trying to sound calm. Just checking the foundation. He laughed. Yeah. Sure. You find a secret door and think, better inspect that structural integrity. Go back upstairs. Trevor. He leaned against the railing. You know what? Maybe I'll stick around. This looks interesting. I could see the greed in his eyes. The same hunger I'd seen in Richard's. He thought there was money hidden down here. Some treasure Grandpa had tucked away. I pushed the door open just enough for the beam of my flashlight to slip inside. The light hit something metallic, reflecting across the walls. I took a step forward and nearly gagged. The air smelled of mold and chemicals. Inside was a small chamber, maybe 10 feet across. Trevor whistled low. What the hell is this place? The walls were lined with framed photographs, each one coated in dust. I wiped the glass of the nearest frame. It was a picture of Richard and Elaine at their wedding. Across both of their faces, drawn in thick red paint, was an X. Trevor moved to another frame. Same thing. My father, my mother, even Trevor himself, all marked with red X's. I turned toward the far wall and saw my own picture, taken when I was a boy. It was the only one untouched. Trevor stepped back, his voice uneasy now. Man, this is messed up. What kind of sick joke is this? I shook my head, unable to speak. My flashlight caught the corner of a wooden desk in the center of the room. On it sat a leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope. My name was written across it in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. Trevor reached for the journal, but I stopped him. Don't. He frowned. What? You think you own this now? This isn't about ownership. He stared at me for a moment, then backed away. Fine. But if there's cash or bonds in there, we split it. I ignored him and picked up the envelope. My hands were shaking. The paper was old but unbroken. I slipped it into my jacket pocket before touching the journal. The leather was cold, stiff with age. I opened the first page and froze. The handwriting was steady, deliberate. The date at the top read March 3. It began with a sentence that made my stomach twist. The family must never know the truth about the company or what I've done to keep them safe. Trevor leaned over my shoulder, reading. Grandpa's lost it. I closed the journal. We're not doing this here. He laughed nervously. Why? Scared of ghosts, I walked toward the door. The red paint on the photographs looked wet under the flashlight, though I knew it couldn't be. It glistened like blood. As I reached the stairs, Trevor called after me. What's in the envelope? I didn't answer. I didn't even look back. All I could think about was the sound the wax made when it cracked. and the feeling that once I'd opened that door, something in the house had started watching me. I locked the panel behind me and pocketed the key. Upstairs, the noise of the family arguing had faded, replaced by the low hum of rain gutters dripping outside. I walked to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope still in my hand. My name stared back at me in that familiar handwriting. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the house breathe. Then I opened it. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper folded twice, yellowed around the edges. My hands felt clumsy as I unfolded it. There were only a few lines, written in the same careful handwriting I had seen my whole life. If you are reading this, it means you have gone where no one else dared. The truth is not a gift, Mark. It is a burden. What you do with it will decide what becomes of this family. Beneath the words was a small symbol drawn in ink, the same crest engraved on the brass key. I sat there staring at it until my eyes blurred. For a long time, I didn't move. Outside, I could hear the low rumble of thunder returning somewhere far off the coast. The old house creaked around me, settling into its bones. A knock came at the door. I folded the letter and shoved it under the mattress before answering. It was Dad. He looked older in the hallway light, shoulders slumped under the weight of something unsaid. You missed dinner, he said quietly. Wasn't hungry. He studied me for a moment, then stepped inside. You went down there, didn't you? I didn't ask how he knew. I just nodded. He rubbed his forehead. I told you to leave it alone. I found an envelope with my name on it. I said, you knew about that room, didn't you? He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. Your grandfather built that room before I was born. He said it was a storage area for old records. But nobody ever went in. I only saw the door once. The wax seal was there even then. Why was it sealed? Because he wanted it sealed. Dad said, whatever's in there. He didn't want the rest of us to find it. There are photographs on the walls. I said, all of us. Everyone in the family. All marked with red X's. Except me. He looked up sharply. What do you mean? Except you. Mine's the only one untouched. He went pale. Mark, listen to me. Don't go back down there. Why not? Because your grandfather did things to protect this family. Things he wasn't proud of. If you stir that up now, you won't like what you find. He stood and walked out before I could say another word. His footsteps faded down the hall. I sat in the dim light, the letter still burning a hole in my mind. Sleep never came that night. I kept seeing the photographs, those red crosses slashing through familiar faces. I kept wondering why I was the only one left unmarked. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps outside my door. Slow. Careful. Not my father's. I waited until they passed, then crept out into the hall. The house was dark, except for a faint light glowing from under the door of the study. I moved closer, heart pounding. Inside, voices whispered. I pressed my ear to the door. Richard's voice, low but sharp. He's got something. I know it. He was seen near the basement. Elaine hissed back. Let it go. Richard. It's done. The old man's dead. If he left something behind, it's ours. A pause. Then the soft clink of glass. If Mark gets in the way. Richard said, we deal with him. My stomach dropped. I backed away before they could hear me. The floorboards creaked anyway. And I froze. The light inside flicked off. I ran quietly down the hall and back to my room. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the door. For a long time I sat on the floor, staring at the letter again. Truth is not a gift. It is a burden. At sunrise, I packed the envelope and the brass key into my jacket. The house was quiet again, the way it used to be before everyone filled it with greed. I went downstairs, planning to leave before anyone woke. But as I passed the kitchen, Trevor stepped out of the shadows, going somewhere. His smile didn't reach his eyes. He still looked rattled from what we had seen in that room. Back to Boston, I said. Need a break. He glanced at the pocket of my jacket. You got that envelope with you? I didn't answer. He sighed. Look, man. Whatever's in there. I don't want trouble. Just tell me what you found. Nothing you'd understand. He blocked my path. Try me. I met his stare until he finally dropped his eyes. He muttered something under his breath and walked away. I stepped outside. The air was cold, sharp with pine and sea salt. My truck sat at the end of the driveway, a thin layer of frost on the windshield. I slid into the driver's seat, but I couldn't start the engine. My hands stayed frozen on the wheel. I could drive away. Forget the photographs, the journal, the letter. Pretend I never saw any of it. But that wasn't who my grandfather raised me to be. I pulled the letter out again. The paper was thin, nearly transparent in the morning light. I turned it over, and that was when I noticed faint indentations on the back, as if someone had written on the sheet above it. I rubbed a pencil lightly across the surface. Words appeared, shaky but legible. If they find this, take it to the vault. The vault. I remembered the old bank in town, the one my grandfather helped build back in the 50s. It had been converted into a law office years ago, but maybe something still remained. I started the engine and drove toward town. The roads were slick, the fog thick as smoke. The bank stood at the end of Main Street, a hulking brick building with boarded windows. A small sign out front read, "For lease." I parked and checked the door. Locked. Of course. I circled around back where a rusted delivery door hung crooked on its hinges. The padlock was gone. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was damp and smelled like rust and mildew. My flashlight cut through the dust. The vault door still stood in the far corner, massive and gray, the paint flaking off in sheets. My breath fogged as I approached. The dial had been removed, but a small keyhole remained near the handle. My heart raced. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass key. It slid in smoothly. The lock turned with a heavy click that echoed through the empty building. I gripped the handle and pulled. The door groaned open, releasing a rush of cold air that smelled faintly of oil and paper. Inside was a metal shelf stacked with old ledgers and boxes. Most were crumbling. The ink faded beyond recognition, but on the top shelf was another envelope, sealed in red wax, marked with the same crest. I climbed up and took it down carefully. The wax cracked beneath my fingers. Inside was a flash drive wrapped in cloth, along with another note in my grandfather's handwriting. For the eyes of the one unmarked, I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, but the beam of my flashlight caught only dust. Another step echoed, closer this time. Richard's voice came out of the darkness. "Should have listened to your father, Mark. Some doors shouldn't be opened." He stepped into the light, his face pale, his expression calm in a way that made my skin crawl. His hand slipped into his coat pocket, and I saw the outline of a gun. I backed away slowly. "You followed me." He nodded once. "You think you can ruin everything he built?" "Everything we built." He raised the gun slightly. "Give me the drive." I gripped it tighter, heart pounding so hard I could barely hear myself speak. "Grandpa didn't build anything, Richard. He covered for you. All of you." He took a step forward. "The gun's steady now." "Maybe he did. But you won't live long enough to tell anyone." The words hung in the air, cold and final. Then something clattered outside. Metal against concrete. Richard turned his head just long enough for me to bolt toward the exit. I ran through the back door into the fog, the sound of my own breath deafening. Behind me, the bank's door slammed open, and his footsteps followed. I didn't look back. I just kept running until the fog swallowed everything. The fog was thick enough to swallow the world. I could barely see 5 feet ahead. But I didn't stop running. My shoes slapped against wet asphalt, lungs burning, the cold air slicing down my throat. Somewhere behind me, Richard was shouting, but the fog distorted his voice until it was impossible to tell how close he was. I turned a corner and stumbled down a side alley between 2 abandoned buildings. My hand brushed against a chain-link fence slick with moisture. I ducked behind a dumpster, crouching low, listening. For a few seconds, all I could hear was my heartbeat. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, the crunch of gravel. He was searching. I pressed my back to the cold metal and held my breath. A moment later the sound faded, swallowed by the mist. When I finally stood up, my legs felt like rubber. I clutched the flash drive in my fist, my knuckles white. The note that came with it was still folded in my pocket. For the eyes of the one unmarked, I made it to my truck parked 2 blocks away. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice before getting the engine started. I locked the doors. Breathing hard. Eyes scanning the fog outside. No movement. I drove toward the edge of town. Headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the gray. By the time I reached the highway, the adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold clarity. Richard had followed me. He had a gun. That meant whatever was on this drive wasn't just some family secret. It was something dangerous. I stopped at a gas station a few miles out and went into the restroom to wash my face. The mirror showed a stranger staring back. My eyes were bloodshot. My skin pale. There was dirt on my jacket and a smear of red wax across my sleeve from the envelope. Back at the truck, I plugged the flash drive into my old laptop. The screen flickered to life, and a single folder appeared. It was labeled simply Records. Inside were dozens of video files and scanned documents. Most of them dated between 1971 and 1998. I opened one at random. The video was grainy, black and white. My grandfather sat at his desk. The same desk still in the mansion study. He looked younger, maybe in his 40s. His voice came through, faint but steady. If anyone finds this, it means I have failed to protect them. He paused, eyes darting to something off camera. You think you can control it, he said quietly. You can't. Once the money starts, it eats everything. He reached for a file on the desk and held it up to the camera. I froze the frame. The header read, Gray Pharmaceuticals. 1,973 contract agreements. Below it was a signature I didn't recognize. Vincent D'Angelo. The name stirred something. I'd heard it once before. Maybe in one of the business magazines that had profiled my grandfather decades ago. A local crime boss who'd vanished in the 70s. My stomach turned. I played another file. This one showed my Uncle Richard, much younger, standing beside my grandfather. They were arguing. It's too late. Richard shouted. You already signed. We can't just back out. My grandfather's face was hard. I didn't build this family to serve criminals. The footage ended abruptly. My hands were trembling again. I sat there in the glow of the laptop. The rain starting to tap against the windshield. A knock on the window nearly made me jump out of my seat. I slammed the laptop shut. A man in a sheriff's jacket was standing outside. His flashlight pointed down. I rolled the window halfway. Evening. Officer. He leaned in. You all right there? Son. Been getting calls about someone tearing around these back roads. Just trying to clear my head. I said. Long night. He studied me for a second. You're a Gray. Right. From the old place up on Ridge Hill. I nodded. He sighed. Heard your grandfather's estate is stirring up some trouble already. Best be careful. That family has a way of making the wrong kind of noise. He tipped his hat and walked back to his cruiser. When his taillights disappeared down the road, I started the truck again and headed home. By the time I got back to the mansion, the sky was beginning to lighten. The fog still hung low over the fields. The house loomed ahead, dark and silent. I parked around back and slipped inside through the kitchen door. The air was heavy with stale smoke, and something else. Something sour. I crept through the hall, careful not to wake anyone. When I reached my room, I locked the door and plugged the flash drive back in. I couldn't stop now. I opened another document. It was a ledger, handwritten, detailing payments made to someone named D'Angelo every month for over 40 years. Millions of dollars. Next to each entry was a note in my grandfather's handwriting. Protection. Silence. I leaned back in the chair, my mind spinning. The pharmaceutical empire. The wealth. The reputation. All of it built on extortion money. My grandfather had been paying off the mob for half a century. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned fast. Richard was standing in the doorway. You really don't know when to quit? Do you? He said softly. I stood, trying to keep my voice steady. You were part of it. He smiled. But it didn't reach his eyes. Part of it, no. Kid. I kept it running after he lost the stomach for it. Somebody had to keep the lights on. He took a step closer. Handed over. The laptop's glow reflected in his eyes. He saw the open document. The numbers. The names. His smile vanished. You have no idea what you're messing with, he said. If this gets out, we all go down. Maybe that's what should happen. He moved faster than I expected. Grabbing the laptop, I lunged to stop him. And the cord yanked from the wall. The screen went black. We struggled, crashing into the desk. Papers scattered across the floor. He shoved me hard against the wall, his breath hot and sour. You think you're some kind of hero, he hissed. You're just like him, too weak to do what's necessary. He pulled the flash drive from the laptop and shoved it into his pocket. Then he stepped back, straightened his jacket, and said, I'll fix this. You stay out of it. He walked out, closing the door behind him. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the empty space where the laptop had been. My hands were bleeding from a cut on my knuckle. The silence pressed in until it was unbearable. I went downstairs. The front door was open. Rain blowing in from the porch. Headlights disappeared down the driveway. Richard was gone. I wanted to chase him, but I didn't even know where to start. Instead, I went back to the study. The fireplace was cold, the room dark, except for the faint glow of morning through the curtains. I sat at the desk, staring at my grandfather's portrait above the mantel. What the hell were you trying to do? I whispered. Protect us, or bury us. The house groaned again. A long, slow creak that sounded almost human, somewhere in the walls. The wind sighed. I could smell the faintest trace of cigar smoke, even though no one had lit one in years. When I turned back toward the desk, something caught my eye. A drawer slightly open, just enough to show a corner of red wax sealing another envelope inside. My chest tightened. I reached for it. The wax bore the same crest as before, the letter G, inside the ring. Beneath it were 4 words in my grandfather's handwriting. When it's too late. I held the envelope in my hands and stared at the portrait again. His painted eyes seemed to follow me, steady and cold. The thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, and I felt the weight of the house pressing down. I didn't open it. Not yet. I wasn't ready to know what else he had buried. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. I turned it over in my hands, running my thumb along the wax seal. The words written across the front looked fresh, like the ink hadn't dried all the way. When it's too late. I set it down on the desk and stared at it for a long time, afraid of what waited inside. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was the kind of silence that made every sound feel wrong. Too sharp. Too alive. I finally broke the seal. Inside was a single photograph and a note. The picture was of Richard and my father, standing outside the original gray pharmaceuticals building. Grandpa was behind them, his face turned away. On the back of the photo was a short line in his handwriting. The company began with a lie. The note that came with it said simply, if they come for you, trust no one. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what scared me more, the warning, or the fact that it sounded like he had known this moment would come. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the stillness. Headlights cut across the windows. I hurried to the front door just in time to see Richard's black sedan pull into the drive. My pulse jumped. He must have realized he couldn't destroy everything alone. He was coming back for me, or for whatever was left. I slipped the photo and the note into my jacket and moved to the hall closet, grabbing the old baseball bat that had been there since I was a kid. My hands were sweating, but I kept my grip tight. The front door opened, and the echo of his footsteps filled the foyer. Mark, he called. We need to talk. I stayed in the shadows near the staircase. His voice sounded calm, almost too calm. You were right, he said. About the company, about what Grandpa did. But if this gets out, it's not just me who goes down. The whole family's finished. Your father, too. That last part hit like a punch. My father Richard stepped further inside, looking around the dim hall. I took a step forward. What are you talking about? He stopped, his eyes locking on mine. You think David didn't know he was signing the checks for 20 years? He played the good man while Grandpa took the heat. Liar. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. You really think anyone in this family is clean? You're the only one naive enough to believe that old man was trying to save us. He was trying to save himself. He took another step, and I raised the bat. Don't come any closer. He lifted his hand slightly. Easy. Mark, I'm not here to hurt you. We can still fix this. We destroy the files. Both copies. Nobody ever has to know. There's no fixing it. I said. Grandpa didn't hide the truth so you could keep stealing. His face changed then. The mask slipped. His eyes hardened. And for a moment I saw the same cold calculation I'd seen in that old video of him with Grandpa. You sound just like him, he said quietly. And look how that ended. Before I could react, he lunged. The bat slipped from my hand as we crashed into the wall. The framed photographs shattered. Glass raining down. We struggled. Knocking over a table. I managed to shove him back. And he stumbled into the living room. Breathing hard. You don't understand, he said. If this comes out, there are people who won't stop until every one of us is gone. The men Grandpa dealt with. They're still out there. Then let them come for me. I said. I'm done living in their shadow. He laughed once. Bitter and short. You think you can fight them. You're not your grandfather. Maybe not. I said. But I'm not you either. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. His car tore down the driveway, gravel spraying into the air. I stood there in the wreckage, my chest heaving. The broken glass glittered on the floor like 100 tiny eyes. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick up the bat again. When I finally sat down, I noticed something wedged beneath the shattered picture frames. It was another photograph, smaller than the rest, half hidden by glass. It showed my grandfather sitting in his office, holding a letter in his hand, the same one I had just read. Behind him, barely visible, was the reflection of a man standing in the doorway. My father. I stared at it until the edges of the room started to blur. The next morning, I drove to his house across town. He answered the door in a worn sweater, looking like he hadn't slept. We need to talk, I said. He nodded and stepped aside. The house smelled like coffee and sawdust, the same as it always had. We sat at the kitchen table, the one Mom used to polish every Sunday. I slid the photograph across to him. He looked at it, his expression tightening. So it's true, I said. You were part of it. He didn't deny it. He just sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I wanted to protect you from this, from all of it. Protect me. You let them poison people and buy silence for decades. It wasn't that simple, he said, his voice low. I didn't know everything at first. By the time I did, I couldn't get out. You could have told me. He looked up then, eyes wet. And make you hate me, I already do. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and ugly. He closed his eyes. Your grandfather carried this alone for too long. He was trying to make it right at the end. That's what this is about. Those letters, that room, the photos. He wanted you to finish what he couldn't. Why me? Because you still believed in him, he said softly. Because you're the only one who still has a conscience. I pushed back from the table, anger and confusion twisting in my chest. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to be part of this cursed legacy. But when I reached the door, he said something that stopped me cold. They'll come for you now. I turned. What do you mean? He looked older than ever. Richard isn't working alone. The people who funded all this, they don't care about family. If they think you have that drive, they'll do whatever it takes to get it back. I stared at him. How do you know that? Because they called me last night. The world seemed to tilt under my feet. I wanted to shout, to demand names. But he just shook his head. Get out of town, Mark. Take what you found and go to the authorities. But don't stay here. I left without another word. The air outside was biting cold. The sky had that washed-out color that comes before a storm. I stood on the porch for a long time, watching the wind whip through the trees. When I finally got in my truck, I looked at the photo again. Grandpa. The letter. My father, in the reflection. All of it leading to this. I didn't know who to trust anymore. But one thing was clear. The truth wasn't just about the past. It was coming for all of us. I drove until the road disappeared into the woods. Until the radio went to static, and the world outside the windshield turned into nothing but gray and pine. My hands were locked around the steering wheel, knuckles white. The photo of my father and grandfather lying face down on the passenger seat. The air inside the truck was stale, heavy with the smell of wet leather and fear. I didn't know where I was going. Only that I couldn't stay. The thought of my father talking to those people, whoever they were, kept looping through my mind. He said they would come for me. And I believed him. I had seen that kind of desperation in Richard's eyes. The kind that belonged to men who had already traded their souls. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small diner off Route 5. I pulled in beside 2 state trooper cars and tried to convince myself that being near law enforcement made me safe. Inside, the place smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease. I sat at the counter and ordered black coffee, watching rain slide down the windows. Every time the door opened, I turned my head, expecting Richard or someone worse to walk through. The waitress was maybe in her 50s. Sharp eyes that noticed everything. "You look like you've been driving a while," she said. "Something like that," I replied. She poured the coffee and leaned on the counter. "You from around here used to be?" I said. "Family stuff brought me back." She gave a knowing smile. "Family'll do that." I nodded and drank the coffee, trying to think. I couldn't keep running forever. I needed to do something with what I had found. The FBI. Maybe. But I had no proof anymore. Richard had taken the drive. Or maybe not. My hand went to my jacket pocket where the smaller envelope was still hidden. I had forgotten the original flash drive. The one I had copied a few files onto before Richard stole the rest. There wasn't much on it. But maybe enough. I finished the coffee and went outside to make a call. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through my contacts and stopped at one name, Rachel Miller. She had been an assistant district attorney once, back before she quit to teach law in Portland. We dated for a few years. Things ended quietly. But she was still one of the few people I trusted. She picked up after the second ring. "Mark, I didn't expect to hear from you. I need help," I said. "It's about my grandfather's company. Something's wrong." "What kind of wrong?" "The kind that gets people killed." There was a pause. "Where are you?" "About an hour north of Bangor." "I can meet you anywhere." "Come to Portland," she said. "Tonight? Bring whatever you have." I hung up and started the truck again. The rain turned into sleet halfway down the highway. My phone buzzed once. An unknown number. I let it ring. Then another call. Same number. I turned it off. By the time I reached Portland, night had fallen. The city lights looked almost clean after the endless gray of the countryside. Rachel lived in a small apartment near the waterfront. She met me at the door. Her hair damp, eyes wary. "You look like hell," she said. "Feels about right." Inside. She locked the door and drew the blinds. I handed her the flash drive. She plugged it into her laptop, her face tightening as she scrolled through the files. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "From my grandfather's vault. There's more. But my uncle took it." She opened one of the video files. The same one I'd seen of my grandfather speaking to the camera. She watched without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When it ended, she sat back. "If this is real, it's not just corporate fraud," she said. "It's organized crime. Money laundering. Decades of it. He was paying off a man named Vincent D'Angelo." I said. Her head snapped up. "D'Angelo, you're serious? He was supposed to have died in '72. Apparently not," I said. "Or if he did, someone kept cashing the checks." She exhaled, slowly. "This is big, Mark. Too big for the local police. I can reach out to someone at the bureau. But you need to stay somewhere safe tonight." "Safe isn't exactly an option." She gave me a look. "Then stay here." Couch pulls out. I started to argue but didn't have the strength. The adrenaline had finally burned out, leaving me hollow. While she made tea, I stood at the window, watching the rain blur the streetlights. Somewhere out there, Richard was probably trying to cover his tracks. And my father was sitting in that old house waiting for something terrible to happen. Rachel joined me at the window. "You're shaking," she said. "I'm fine. You're not. Whatever this is, you're in over your head." "I know." She placed a hand on my arm. "I'll call my contact first thing in the morning. We'll get you protection if this pans out." I nodded, though I doubted any of it would be that easy. I slept in fits that night. Every sound from the street made my heart jump. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the soft buzz of Rachel's phone. She was still asleep. I checked the screen. Unknown number. The message preview read, "Tell him to stop digging, or he ends up like the old man." I deleted it before she could see. I didn't need her caught in this. At sunrise, I slipped out quietly, leaving a note that said, "I'd be back." I drove to the police station downtown and asked to speak to a detective. The officer at the front desk gave me a skeptical look until I mentioned Gray Pharmaceuticals. 10 minutes later, a tall man in a gray suit came out to meet me. Detective Harris. He led me to an office and shut the door. "You said you had evidence of a crime connected to the Gray estate," he said. I handed him the flash drive. He studied it like it was a live grenade. "What's on it?" "Video files. Payments. Contracts. A connection to organized crime." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You understand the weight of what you're saying I do?" He nodded slowly. "I'll have forensics look at it. You'll stay in town until we contact you." I agreed, though I knew I wouldn't wait long. When I left the station, the morning light was harsh and thin. I stopped at a coffee shop across the street and sat by the window, staring at the people passing by. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that the truth would come out, and it would all end there. Then my phone buzzed again. A text. This time from my father. It was just 3 words. "They're here now." I froze. My heart started pounding so hard I couldn't breathe. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. I left the coffee half full and ran to my truck. The drive back to Gray Hill felt endless. The closer I got, the heavier the air became. Like the storm hadn't left. When I turned onto the gravel drive, I could already see 2 black cars parked outside the house. I killed the engine and crouched low behind the steering wheel. The front door was wide open. Figures moved inside. Dark shapes against the light from the hall. I counted 3. Maybe 4. One of them was dragging something heavy across the floor. I reached for my phone, but my hands were shaking too hard. I managed to hit record on the camera and zoom in through the windshield. A man stepped into the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black coat. He looked straight toward the truck, and for a second, I thought he could see me. Then, the lights inside flickered and went out. The house went dark, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. I slipped out of the truck and moved through the trees, keeping low. The cold bit into my skin as I crept closer to the house. The only light now came from the faint glow of the porch lamp, swinging in the wind. I could hear voices inside, muffled and sharp. One of them was my father's. My stomach clenched. I reached the back porch and crouched beside the cellar doors. They were cracked open, the wood wet from the rain. I listened. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing across the kitchen floor. Then a voice I didn't recognize, deep and calm. "Find the drives. He's already talked to someone." My pulse spiked. I pushed the doors open slowly and slipped into the basement. The air smelled like dust and oil. The flashlight in my pocket cast a narrow beam across the stone walls. I moved quietly through the shadows until I reached the bottom of the old staircase leading up to the kitchen. Through the floorboards above, I could see the faint outlines of 3 men. One of them shoved my father into a chair. "Where is it?" "Mr. Gray?" the deep voice asked. Dad didn't answer. I could barely hear him. Just a rasp. "Go to hell." There was a dull crack, the sound of a punch. I felt the air leave my lungs. Another voice said, "Check upstairs. If the son's here, bring him too." I didn't have time to think. I backed away from the stairs and moved toward the far end of the basement. The hidden door to the sealed room was still there, faintly outlined in the wall. I pressed against it until it opened. Inside, the red X's glared at me through the dark, every face frozen in silence. I closed the door behind me and turned off the light. I could hear footsteps above, moving from room to room. Boards groaned. Glass shattered. One of the men said, "Nothing up here." "Maybe he ran." The deep voice again. "Then find him." I looked around the small room, trying to calm my breathing. My eyes adjusted to the dim glow from the cracks in the wall. The desk was still in the center. The leather journal where I'd left it. I hesitated, then opened it again, flipping to the last page I hadn't read before. The writing was different here, slower, as if my grandfather had written it with shaking hands. If you are reading this, then it has already begun. The men I worked with never die. They simply change names. The money bought us time, but it also bought our silence. You cannot buy both. I ran my hand across the page. There was something else taped beneath it. A small plastic card. Worn but intact. I pulled it free. It was an old security badge with the gray pharmaceuticals logo and a name that wasn't my grandfather's. Vincent D'Angelo. My grandfather had kept his partner's ID all this time. The sound of footsteps crept closer. Now coming down the basement stairs. I killed the flashlight and crouched behind the desk. The door to the room rattled, then stopped. A voice said quietly, "I know you're in there. Mark." It was Richard. I froze. He tapped the wall twice, the sound echoing like a heartbeat. "You never were good at hiding. Kid, come out and let's end this." I didn't move. My grip tightened around the flashlight. He tried the handle again, then sighed. "You know what Grandpa wanted, don't you? He wanted you to take the fall. He left you the trail because he knew you'd follow it." I stayed silent. He laughed softly. "You think he was some hero, cleaning up the family name. He was cleaning up his mess. The mob didn't destroy this family. He did." I could hear him pacing outside. The sound of his shoes scraping against the floor sent shivers up my spine. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "You give me that badge, the drives, whatever else you found, and this ends tonight." I didn't answer. I was trying to think, trying to remember the layout of the basement. There was another exit, a maintenance hatch near the back wall. Small, but maybe enough to crawl through. I slipped the badge into my pocket and started moving toward it, careful not to make a sound. Then a beam of light cut through the crack in the door. Richard's voice hardened. "Fine. Have it your way." The next sound was the click of a lighter. I looked back just in time to see smoke start curling under the door. Gasoline. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the flashlight and ran to the back wall. My fingers found the edge of the hatch. It was rusted shut. Smoke filled the room, thick and acrid, burning my throat. I coughed, pulling harder until the latch snapped. The hatch opened just wide enough for me to squeeze through. I crawled into the narrow tunnel that led under the house. The smoke followed me, chasing every breath. I crawled faster, my palms scraping against rock. Behind me, the sound of crackling wood grew louder. Then, a loud crash. Maybe part of the ceiling collapsing. I pushed through the end of the tunnel and tumbled out into the wet grass behind the house. The night air hit me like a shock. I coughed until my chest hurt, staring back at the windows glowing orange. Flames were licking up the curtains. I staggered toward the trees. The front of the house was chaos now. Shouts cutting through the crackle of fire. Two of the men ran out the front door, yelling for water. But the flames were spreading fast. I didn't see my father. I ducked behind a tree and tried to steady my breathing. The badge was still in my hand, warm from my grip. I heard sirens in the distance, faint but growing louder. Someone must have called it in. The fire cast long shadows through the smoke. I could see figures moving, one of them breaking away from the others and heading toward the woods. Richard. He was limping, coughing, but still carrying something in his hand. I could see the glint of metal. He turned once, scanning the trees, then disappeared into the darkness. I wanted to follow him, but the sirens were almost on top of us now. I stayed hidden as the first fire trucks pulled up. The red lights flashed across the trees, painting the world in blood and smoke. I backed away deeper into the woods until the house was just a glow behind me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number again. This time I answered. A voice I didn't recognize said, "We warned you to stop. You should have listened." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood there in the dark, the fire roaring behind me, the phone still warm in my hand. I looked at the badge again. The name printed under the photo. Vincent D'Angelo. The truth wasn't buried in that house anymore. It was walking around, alive, wearing someone else's face. I kept walking until the firelight disappeared behind the trees. The woods were wet and quiet, except for the crackle of branches under my boots. The badge burned cold in my hand, its plastic slick with rain. Vincent D'Angelo. The name felt like a curse that had been following my family for half a century. By the time I reached the highway, Dawn had started to bleed into the sky. Smoke drifted over the ridge, turning the horizon gray. I stood on the shoulder for a minute, watching the distant glow fade. I didn't know if my father had made it out. The thought hit hard enough to buckle my knees. But I forced myself back up. I couldn't stop now. I drove south toward Portland again, the badge sitting on the seat beside me. My clothes smelled like smoke. At every red light, I checked the mirrors, half expecting a black sedan to appear behind me. None did. The city looked almost peaceful when I pulled into the parking lot outside Rachel's apartment, but peace felt impossible. She opened the door before I knocked. The moment she saw my face, her expression changed. "Mark." "What happened?" "The house burned. My father was inside." Her hand went to her mouth. "My God. It wasn't an accident." I said. "They were looking for me. For this." I set the badge on her counter. She stared at it for a long time before picking it up. "Whose name is that? A man who shouldn't exist." "My grandfather's partner." She exhaled, the color draining from her face. "You need to go to the authorities right now. If people are dead, this isn't just corruption anymore. It's murder." "I already tried that. The detective in Portland has the files. They probably got to him by now, too." She looked at me, steady but scared. "Then, we go higher. The bureau. I can make a call." I nodded. While she dialed, I paced the small living room, trying not to think about my father's voice or the way the fire had sounded when the roof gave out. Rachel hung up and turned to me. "They're sending someone. An agent I know from Boston. He'll meet us at the Federal Building in an hour." An hour felt like a lifetime. But I didn't argue. I went to the sink, splashed water on my face, and stared at my reflection. The man in the mirror looked like a stranger again. Hair matted, eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched tight. I didn't recognize him anymore. When we got to the Federal Building, the agent was already waiting. He was in his 40s. Short hair. Suit too neat for the hour. "Sarah Coleman, FBI," she said as she extended her hand. I blinked. I'd expected a man. She didn't seem to care about my surprise. She motioned for us to follow her into a conference room. The walls were pale gray, the air humming with the sound of fluorescent lights. Rachel did most of the talking. She handed over the files, the copied drive, and told her what had happened. Coleman listened without interrupting, taking notes. When Rachel finished, she leaned back in her chair. "So your grandfather was paying off a man named Vincent D'Angelo," she said. "And you think this man is still alive?" "I don't think. I know." She tapped the badge against the table. "This photo is from the 70s. Even if he survived, he'd be in his 90s now. Then someone else is using his name." I said, "The people who came after me. They're still working under him." She studied me for a long moment. "We've had open cases linked to the D'Angelo syndicate since before you were born. If what you're saying is true, this could connect a lot of dots. But you understand what happens next." I nodded. "You go under protection until we confirm the evidence. No calls. No press. No contact with your family. There's no family left." I said. Coleman didn't flinch. "Then it should be easy." She stood and left the room with the files. Rachel gave me a small, tired smile. "You did the right thing." "I wish it felt like it." I said. An agent walked me to a temporary office on the lower floor, a place where they processed witnesses. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets, and the air smelled like coffee and old paper. They asked me for a statement. Every detail from the will to the fire. By the time they finished, it was nearly evening. Coleman returned with a grim look. "We verified part of what you gave us. The payments from Gray Pharmaceuticals were real. The accounts were still active until 6 months ago." 6 months. That was around the time Grandpa died. She nodded. "Someone has been moving money since then. Cleaning the trail. Whoever they are, they know what you found." "So what now?" She hesitated. "We're coordinating with financial crimes and organized crime units. But if what's on that drive is accurate, you just exposed a network that's been operating under the radar for 50 years. Her phone buzzed. She answered, then frowned. She turned to me. The local fire department recovered a body from the remains of the Gray estate. Male. Mid-60s. My throat went dry. They also found something else. She continued. A second flash drive inside a locked safe. Mostly melted but recoverable. It was labeled D'Angelo. She met my eyes. You were right. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My father was gone. But he must have found the drive before the fire. Maybe he tried to hide it. Maybe he was trying to make things right. Coleman's expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss. Mr. Maine. Gray. I nodded, staring at the floor. The room felt smaller with every breath. That night they put me in a hotel under a fake name. The room was sterile. The curtains drawn. I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the fire, hearing my father's voice. Around midnight, there was a knock on the door. My heart jumped. I looked through the peephole. Rachel. I opened the door fast. What are you doing here? She looked nervous, glancing down the hallway. I had to see you. I talked to Coleman again. There's something she didn't tell you. What is it? The name on the accounts that kept moving money after your grandfather's death. It wasn't Richard. It wasn't D'Angelo either. It was your father. That doesn't make sense. I said. He was scared of them. Or he was trying to control them. She said quietly. Maybe he made a deal. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. My mind flashed back to his face at the kitchen table. The way he said they'd call him. He wasn't warning me. He was warning them. I stumbled back. Sitting on the edge of the bed. Rachel's voice was soft. Maybe he thought he could stop it from the inside. Maybe he was trying to protect you. I shook my head. Or maybe he couldn't let go. She sat beside me. What are you going to do? I looked toward the window. The city lights reflecting on the glass. The truth wasn't over yet. I could feel it. Somewhere out there, someone was still pulling the strings. Still using my family's name to hide the past. I took the badge from my pocket and turned it in my hands. The photo of Vincent D'Angelo stared back. The face of a man who had destroyed everything we were. Rachel watched me. What is it? I looked up. If D'Angelo's name is still active in those accounts, then someone is signing for him. I want to know who. She frowned. That's not our job anymore. It is now. The rain started again outside. Soft and steady. The city lights flickered on the wet pavement. I slipped the badge into my jacket and stood. The storm wasn't finished. And neither was I. The morning came heavy with fog. The kind that blurred the skyline and made the streets feel unreal. I sat in the hotel room chair, still holding the badge. The faint outline of Vincent D'Angelo's face, staring through the plastic like a ghost that refused to fade. Rachel had fallen asleep on the couch hours ago. But I hadn't closed my eyes once. Every time I tried, I saw fire, my father's face, and that sealed door in the basement. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't running anymore. I needed to know who was still using that name, who was keeping my family chained to ghosts. I slipped out quietly, leaving Rachel a note on the nightstand. She deserved better than another morning of my chaos. Outside, the city was quiet. Fog curling around the harbor like smoke. I drove to Gray Pharmaceuticals headquarters, the glass tower downtown that my grandfather had built in the 80s. It was sleek now, modern, too clean to show its age. But I could feel him there somehow. In the weight of the name on the sign out front. Inside, the lobby smelled like antiseptic and money. The receptionist smiled politely until she saw my ID. Her face changed fast. One moment calm, the next pale and nervous. She typed something on her screen, then pressed a button beneath the desk. Security's on their way up, she said softly. I didn't wait. I walked straight past the elevators and into the executive wing. The badge from the vault had no chip, but it looked old enough to be real. When I pressed it to the scanner at the private elevator, the light blinked green. My stomach dropped. The doors opened to the top floor, where the glass walls looked out over the bay. The air was too still. Only one light was on at the far end of the corridor. I followed it to the corner office. Inside, someone was waiting. Richard. He looked worse than the last time I saw him. Thinner, hair gray at the edges, a bandage around his hand. You shouldn't have come here, he said quietly. I took a step closer. You started the fire. His eyes flickered. It wasn't supposed to go that far. They were only supposed to scare you. Who are they? He hesitated, then pointed at the window where the skyline glowed faintly behind the fog. The same men Grandpa worked for. D'Angelo was never just one man. Mark. It was a name. A brand for something bigger. When the old one died, someone else took the name. Your father was one of them. I stared at him, trying to process the words. My father worked for them. He didn't have a choice. None of us did. You think you can drag this all into the light? But you don't understand what that means. I took the badge from my pocket and threw it on the desk. It landed with a hard slap. Then tell me who's left. He didn't answer. The door behind me opened, and two men in suits stepped in. One of them I recognized from the night of the fire. His eyes were cold and bored. The kind of look that didn't care whether I lived or died. Richard spoke softly. You should have listened to me. One of the men reached for a gun. I didn't think. I just moved. I grabbed the edge of the desk and shoved it hard, knocking the lamp over. The room went dark except for the morning light spilling through the window. A shot went off. Glass shattered. And Richard screamed. I ducked behind the overturned desk. My ears rang. Another shot hit the wall inches from my head. I crawled toward the far end of the office where the emergency exit door stood half open. I pushed through and ran into the stairwell. My shoes slamming against metal steps. Voices echoed behind me. Shouting. Closing in. I pushed harder. Every step a blur of noise and panic. When I burst into the parking garage below, my lungs felt like fire. I ducked behind a concrete pillar, just as the elevator doors opened at the far end. They stepped out slowly, scanning the area. I could hear their footsteps. Steady. Confident. I spotted a service hallway to my left and sprinted for it, grabbing the badge from my pocket. There was a keypad at the end. I swiped the badge. The lock clicked. Inside was a maintenance corridor lined with old pipes and flickering lights. I followed it until it opened into another section of the basement. This one filled with file cabinets and boxes labeled Gray Archive. The air was damp and still. I pulled open one of the drawers. Inside were contracts, reports, and old payment ledgers, all marked with the same initials, VD, D'Angelo. Some dated as far back as 1961. My hands shook as I scanned through the papers. It was all there. Decades of cover-ups. Shell companies. Fake names. Payoffs to government officials. It wasn't just my family. It was half the city. Behind me. Footsteps echoed again. I turned, clutching one of the files. The man in the black coat stepped into the light. The one who had looked at me through the truck window that night. He smiled faintly. You really don't know when to quit. I raised the folder like it was a weapon. What is this? Who are you? He nodded toward the papers. I'm the one who keeps the lights on. You think your grandfather built this empire alone? We let him build it. When he tried to stop paying, we reminded him what he owed. He took another step. Put that down. And you can still walk away. I glanced at the fire alarm on the wall. My fingers brushed against the lever. I'm done walking away, I said. I pulled the alarm. The shrill siren filled the basement. The man cursed and reached for his gun. But I had already grabbed a box of files and bolted toward the stairwell. I could hear shouts behind me as sprinklers kicked in, spraying cold water that soaked everything. I burst through the exit door into the alley behind the building. Rachel was there, her car engine running. She'd tracked my phone. I jumped in and slammed the door. Go. I yelled. She hit the gas. Tires screeching on wet pavement. Behind us, security guards spilled into the alley, shouting orders into radios. She glanced at me, soaked, shaking, clutching the box. Please tell me you got something. Enough to end it, I said. We drove straight to the federal building. Agent Coleman met us in the lobby with a team already waiting. I handed her the files, dripping and heavy with water. She took one look and called for evidence bags. This is everything, I said. The whole network. She nodded once. You just exposed one of the oldest criminal syndicates on record. It took weeks for the investigation to unravel the truth. Dozens of arrests. Politicians. Executives. Men who thought they were untouchable. My father's name was cleared publicly. But the guilt stayed with me. I visited what was left of the estate when the snow melted. The land was quiet again. Just ashes and grass. I rebuilt the headstone with my own hands. No marble. No gold. Just granite and truth carved into stone. David Gray. He carried his sins and still chose to make them right. Sometimes I still dream of that room in the basement. The red X's on every face but mine. Now I understand. Grandpa didn't mark them as enemies. He marked them as lost. The only one left unmarked was the one who still had a choice. I took the badge out of my pocket and set it on the ground beside the grave. The rain washed over it, dulling the plastic until the name disappeared beneath the water. For the first time in years, I felt the weight lift. The truth had cost everything, but it was finally free. If you made it this far, tell me what you think truth really costs. Because sometimes, it's not the lies that destroy a family. It's the silence that follows them. Stay with me, and I'll tell you what came next.